I don't know who you are, the alien commander declared over every global broadcast frequency. But if Earth had power, it would have spoken by now. On a cracked radio in rural Wyoming, the only reply was a chuckle from a man in a flannel shirt who hadn't spoken to a machine in 10 years. He took a sip of coffee, stretched his legs, and said to no one in particular, "Well, guess I'm power now." The sky was full of laughter that morning, but not the good kind. Alien laughter had an odd tone to it, like knives clinking inside crystal glasses, mocking and amused. They weren't even trying to pretend Earth was a threat anymore. The Narland Confederacy had declared the planet a passive extraction zone. That meant no negotiations, no diplomacy, just scavenging rights and open condescension. Their declaration played across every known channel, and even hijacked private satellites to reach Earth's most remote corners. One of the alien leaders leaned back in his floating chair and said, "Earth is background noise. A stubborn weed without roots." In the heart of Washington, D.C., world leaders sat frozen. There had been no war, no warning, no skirmish. Just silence from the stars for decades until, all at once, Earth was scanned, mocked, and declared irrelevant. The United Nations emergency meeting spiraled into chaos. Generals barked into dead radios. Heads of state shouted across jammed frequencies. Satellites blinked out one by one like dying stars. Systems were being hijacked from above, rerouted, overwritten. The aliens hadn't just called Earth powerless, they'd made it so. But hundreds of miles away, in a sleepy corner of Wyoming, the news barely stirred the morning. The diner was quiet, with only the low hiss of scrambled eggs on a grill and the clink of a porcelain mug against the counter. The old man in booth 4 didn't look up when the broadcast hit the static-filled radio in the corner. Most people would have missed the crackle of the alien message under the local weather report. Most people would have missed the shift in the old man's posture, the way his shoulders straightened as if he were standing at attention, even though he didn't rise from his seat. Lucy, the waitress, brought him another cup of coffee without asking. She'd been working there for 8 years and still didn't know his last name. Folks just called him Grady, or sometimes Operator, because of a rumor that he once worked for some military group that didn't exist anymore. He never denied it. He never confirmed it either. He just smiled the way people smile when they know something they can't explain. That smile returned as he took a sip of the fresh coffee, listening to the alien commander's final declaration. Earth has no teeth. Only rust. We will be done before it blinks. Grady leaned back in the booth and tapped his mug twice, a habit from somewhere long ago. Outside, the wind was picking up. The power lines buzzed, and a hawk circled lazily overhead, completely unaware that Earth had just been marked as galactic roadkill. Grady took one last sip, then set the mug down gently, almost ceremoniously. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and pulled a worn leather satchel from beneath the booth. The only thing inside was a piece of paper folded into quarters. He didn't open it yet. Back underground, deep below Colorado in a bunker that hadn't seen visitors in 23 years, an alarm triggered by the alien declaration lit up a dusty panel. The computer that housed Project Black Key flickered to life. It was never meant to run long-term. It didn't even recognize most modern Earth protocols. But its last stored program was set to execute if Earth was ever downgraded to primitive. The screen lit up with a single message. In the event of planetary classification collapse, locate asset, operator. The technicians working the base were too young to know what operator meant. One of them asked if it was a radio station. Another said it might be a nuclear protocol. But the oldest man in the room, a janitor with a limp and one working eye, dropped his mop when he saw the screen. He didn't say a word. He just turned and left the room. Elsewhere, in orbit around Earth, the Narland officers celebrated. They had begun their descent with high-efficiency mining probes. They bypassed military bases entirely. No need to provoke resistance when Earth's defense grid was already rerouted to loop cat videos. They landed first in rural zones to establish resource collection zones. In Wyoming, just 3 miles from Grady's diner, a sleek black probe touched down in a cornfield. Its legs hissed into the soil, sending waves of heat sensors underground. It marked the area for atmospheric scrubbing, then began calibration. It never finished. A click echoed under the ground. The probe pulse red once, then went dark. It collapsed in on itself, not from an attack, but from what the alien ship recorded as kinetic pressure from obsolete Earth mining ordnance. But there had never been mines placed there, at least, not that the current government had logged. Grady walked past the field 5 minutes later, not even glancing at the wreckage. In D.C., the UN sent a delegation to the orbiting Narland cruiser. They requested negotiations, talks, compromise. The reply was static, then a laughing voice. You can't compromise when you're mute. All over Earth, people panicked. Some fled cities. Others flooded social media, begging for answers. But nothing worked. The sky itself had become a wall of silence, broken only by the occasional hiss of Narland transmissions mocking Earth's collapse. There were no heroes. No plan. No defense. Or so it seemed. Grady reached the edge of town just as the wind picked up. He pulled a small rectangular device from his coat. It looked like an old pager. He pressed a single button. No lights. No sounds. But somewhere, in places no one remembered, machines powered by silence came back online. Code buried under decades of obsolescence began to stir. The old power lines buzzed louder. Somewhere in the Pacific, a buoy that hadn't moved in 40 years turned to face the sky. Inside the diner, Lucy looked out the window and saw the cornfields smoldering. She glanced down at the booth and saw the mug still steaming, Grady's usual coin tip beneath it. She squinted. The coin wasn't American. She'd never seen that symbol before. It looked older than anything in the register. She stepped outside to call him back, but he was already gone, walking toward the hills like someone just clocking into work. The radio crackled again. The alien voice sneered. No power. Only noise. Miles away, Grady smiled. That's the thing about noise, he said, pulling the folded paper from his pocket and looking down at the blackened ink. Sometimes it scrambles brains better than bullets. Then he vanished into the wind, leaving behind a world about to remember the meaning of power. The sky over the Midwest had started to change, but not in the way people expected. It wasn't thunder or storm clouds. It was quiet. Unnaturally quiet. Birds that usually chirped in the early morning had flown south days ahead of schedule. Livestock paced their pens in odd circles. Radios that had been hijacked by alien broadcasts now hissed static, then went dead. Some blamed solar flares. Others whispered about invasion. But nobody truly understood what was unfolding. Except one man walking through the Wyoming hills with a slight limp and a knowing smirk. Grady didn't rush. He didn't need to. He had already been where the rest of the world was heading. At a regional surveillance station near Nevada, a technician named Reynolds noticed something strange. On a long decommissioned screen tied to a forgotten orbital grid, he saw a blinking green dot. He didn't recognize the system. It wasn't tied to any satellite name he knew. The code read Skylock, an acronym he'd never seen before. Curious, he pinged it. The screen flashed back with a simple message. Awaiting Overwatch. Reynolds thought it was a glitch, but the green dot blinked twice, then went still. A moment later, the power flickered in the room. When the lights came back on, the terminal had wiped itself. Grady's pickup truck was old, rusted, and stubborn. The kind that only started when you spoke to it like a horse. He opened the door, tossed the satchel onto the passenger seat, and twisted the key. The truck hummed once, then growled to life. A low-frequency tone spilled from the broken radio, then leveled into a robotic voice. Omega Protocol initiated. Skylock incomplete. Awaiting Overwatch. Grady drummed his fingers on the wheel. Then he leaned down and flicked a switch no modern mechanic would have ever noticed, tucked beneath the dash behind a cracked cassette player. He spoke calmly. Overwatch here. Tag Alpha. Begin blind. The signal carried on frequencies no human civilian could detect, designed to ride beneath the static of radio towers, passing unnoticed through power lines and water pipes. The old system was talking again. In bunkers forgotten by all but the dirt above them, dormant machines stirred. Some whirred to life with bursts of dust, others pulsed faint blue beneath layers of decay. In a substation hidden inside the Appalachian Mountains, a rust-covered cabinet blinked with a single word, Overwatch confirmed. Nearby, a terminal rolled out a list of tags, each tied to an operative with no last name and a location vague enough to require coordinates last updated during the Cold War. One by one, the dormant systems reached out. The first to answer wasn't a soldier. She was a baker. Or that's what she'd been for the last 15 years. Her name was Clara, and she lived in the backwoods of Oregon, making sourdough and selling it at farmers' markets. But when her landline rang, an actual rotary phone mounted to the wall, she didn't hesitate. The voice on the other end said one word. Overwatch. She didn't respond. She hung up, walked to the attic, and opened a long-sealed trunk. Inside were blueprints, tools, and a badge that hadn't seen light in a decade. Clara wiped the dust off and smiled. Didn't think we'd actually use this old net? In Berlin, a blind man named Victor sat on a park bench feeding pigeons. His cane was a lie. He hadn't needed it in years. He wore dark glasses because his real eyes had been replaced long ago by a now obsolete skin system that could see in thermal, radio, and electromagnetic bands. When a child nearby dropped a toy and it landed at his feet, Victor bent down, picked it up, and slipped something into his pocket in the same movement. A metal token had rolled beside the toy. It bore the symbol of the original Helix program. He turned it over once, nodded, and stood. He didn't need an order. The token was enough. The operator hadn't just pressed a button. He had pulled back a veil. Earth's real defenses had never been about firepower. They had been about patience, misdirection, and shadow. The alien forces had scanned for nukes, satellites, missiles. They didn't scan old women with gardens or ex-fishermen living off-grid. They didn't notice that some of the abandoned oil rigs had signal amplifiers buried beneath them. They didn't realize that the man who taught their engineers Earth languages decades ago hadn't just taught them how to read, he taught them how to misread. Back on the cruiser above Earth, the alien commanders were growing annoyed. Their primary drone squads were reporting resistance, not from militaries, but from anomalies. Mining equipment malfunctioned. Resource extraction software was being overwritten mid-sequence. The code looked like Earth's old programming, except every string looped into itself and infected their systems like slow poison. One of the Narlan lieutenants demanded a full purge. The admiral laughed. Purge what? Earth can't fight. They can't even reach us. This is weather interference. But the laughter was tight. Forced. For the first time, they'd encountered errors they couldn't track. In a desert testing field in Arizona, a hatch opened beneath the sand. A drone the size of a school bus crawled out, moving silently. It wasn't alien. It was human-built, painted with dust-resistant nanocoating and powered by buried copper coils. It hadn't moved since the day it was buried 25 years ago. But today, its sensors locked onto a Narlan scout drone and followed it. A single strike, not explosive but electronic, knocked the alien drone from the sky without leaving a scratch. No smoke. No wreckage. Just complete system paralysis. The Earth drone watched for 10 more seconds, then returned underground and resealed the hatch. Lucy, back at the diner, noticed the lights flickering. She hadn't seen Grady since that morning, but she found herself staring at the empty booth he used to sit in. The radio had gone silent again, but the TV mounted on the wall now displayed a grainy message. It wasn't a news channel. Just text scrolling slowly. Skylock activated. Tags accepted. Her phone buzzed with a new update. No notifications. No alerts. Just a photo she'd never taken, Grady, decades younger, standing beside a group of soldiers in mismatched gear, all staring into a camera like they'd just buried something important. Grady pulled off the highway and drove into a forest trail no GPS could register. The truck stopped near a ridge. There, he approached a metal hatch overgrown with moss. He knelt, pressed his palm against a panel, and waited. The moss receded. The hatch groaned and split open. He stepped inside. The lights inside the tunnel flickered on. No alarms. No cameras. Just quiet acceptance. As he walked deeper, a voice echoed down the hall. Welcome back, Overwatch. System integration in progress. Estimated time to global blind, 17 hours. He nodded. Plenty of time. Outside, the alien cruiser prepared its next wave. But for the first time, their systems hesitated. No clear target. No stable signals. Earth's layout didn't make sense anymore. Cities went quiet. Power grids realigned. Data vanished mid-transmission. They were no longer looking at a planet. They were looking at a puzzle. And in that moment, they forgot the oldest rule in any war. Never underestimate the man who leaves the room before the fight begins. Especially if he leaves smiling. The alien cruiser descended with slow arrogance, its underbelly glowing with a violet shimmer that painted the clouds in sickly hues. To the alien officers on board, it was a routine procedure. Touch down in a remote area, anchor a siphon rig, begin the quiet work of draining Earth's mineral veins and atmospheric composites. They didn't bring armor, didn't bring security, and didn't even scan for resistance. It wasn't arrogance anymore, it was habit. Primitive planets didn't shoot back. They just folded. The admiral in charge of this mission, Commander Velra, selected a landing site near the Great Plains, specifically a wide-open Kansas field bordered by a rusting barbed wire fence and a sagging wooden barn. They noted the lifeforms nearby: livestock, unarmed humans, low technology. One of the officers muttered that this zone wouldn't even be worth recording. Velra agreed. He tapped the approval pad. The cruiser settled in with a soft hum and hissed its first landing pylon into the dirt. What Velra didn't know was that the barn they saw wasn't a barn. It had been, once, a long time ago. But now it was something else entirely. And the livestock weren't just cows. One of them was fitted with a harness that carried a dormant signal relay hidden beneath fake cowhide. None of it showed up on the scans because it had been designed not to. Earth didn't hide its weapons underground. It disguised them in plain sight. Inside the barn, a woman named Elsie finished stacking what looked like hay bales but were, in fact, signal jammers disguised in decades-old hay casings. She wore an apron, dusted in flour, and carried a basket of eggs. Her movements were slow, practiced, and deliberate. When the alien rig extended its anchor probe toward her property, she didn't run or scream. She simply stepped out into the yard, adjusted her hat, and stared straight at the descending machine. The probe hissed as it deployed a vaporizing beam meant to cut through soil. But the moment the beam touched the ground, a deep hum began pulsing from underneath. The beam flickered, bent sideways, and snapped off. The alien technicians inside the cruiser panicked, blaming environmental interference. They tried again. The beam activated. And this time, the barn exploded. Not in a fiery burst, but in a controlled detonation. Every outward wall folded down in sequence, revealing a small field of spring-loaded projectors and ancient railguns, the kind no one thought Earth even had anymore. They weren't aimed at the sky. They were aimed directly at the cruiser's exposed siphon arm. With a screech of metal and a roar like a dying engine, the arm was sheared off and hurled across the field. Smoke billowed into the air as Elsie calmly walked back inside her home and shut the door. She didn't even look back. The aliens scrambled to respond. Inside the cruiser, alarms finally began to sound. Velra barked commands, demanding to know what kind of counterforce they had encountered. His tactical officer shouted that their probe had been compromised by residual planetary tech. But Velra knew better. That wasn't residual. That was current. Coordinated. Deliberate. He ordered a scan for human military presence. The results came back negative. And that's what scared him the most. Because it meant this wasn't the work of Earth's governments. At a secondary landing site in Texas, another siphon rig began activating. This one targeted a power station marked as inactive. But when the tractor beam locked onto the grid, it began pulling something unexpected. Instead of minerals, it locked onto a mobile nuke container rigged for reflection. Before the crew could disengage the beam, the container surged upward and slammed into the belly of the cruiser. There was no detonation. The weapon wasn't meant to explode. It was meant to fry systems from the inside out. When the cruiser's backup computers tried to reroute the overload, they found themselves overridden by a viral command line. The name of the program was simple: Laugh Track 42. Velra's eyes narrowed when the name came up. He didn't understand it. None of their analysts did. But the script had infected nearly half the cruiser's secondary systems before being quarantined. Their defense algorithms tried to trace the source but found only dead loops and taunting lines of code that read like riddles. One subroutine simply said, "Didn't your engineers learn this trick from us?" Back on Earth, in an old water tower in Tennessee, a camera clicked on for the first time in decades. It wasn't pointed at anything important. It was pointed up, at the stars. Its lens shimmered with infrared and subspace clarity. At the exact moment Laugh Track 42 deployed, the camera pulsed a short burst of data into the sky, targeting a relay satellite no one even knew was active. A few seconds later, across Earth's communication grid, something strange happened. The signal jamming broke. But instead of silence being replaced with alien broadcasts, all screens filled with a single grainy image. Grady. He was seated in front of what looked like a fireplace, sipping something from a steel mug. His face was calm. Older. Eyes relaxed. The smile was faint but unmistakable. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said one line. "You forgot we taught your engineers." Then the feed cut out. Velra's command deck went silent. He demanded an immediate data analysis. The only information recovered from the message was its point of origin. Not a military base. Not a command hub. But a public access network buried under a diner in rural Wyoming. When a squad was sent to investigate, they found the building intact, abandoned, the door left open. On the counter was a mug still steaming and a note scrawled onto a napkin. It read, "You're late." Panic began to ripple through the Narlan fleet. This wasn't a coordinated Earth government defense. This was something older. Smarter. Something that had been built with the understanding that Earth might lose every surface battle but still win the war. They tried to regroup and recalibrate. But their own systems weren't responding as expected. Every attempt to scan for hostile command signals looped them back into blank screens. Their own internal AI assistants began to glitch. One tried to report status, and instead displayed a video of a cat chasing a laser pointer for 3 minutes. Velra ordered a full retaliatory strike, only to discover that the targeting systems wouldn't align. The fleet's internal navigation had somehow been shifted by a constellation pattern that didn't exist anymore. Earth's ancient satellites, long dismissed as trash in orbit, were moving. Not by thrusters, but by internal gyroscopes reactivated from a dormant power protocol designed to mimic orbital decay. The satellites weren't obsolete. They were decoys. Bait. And they had just rerouted the cruiser's targeting optics to look back at itself. On Earth, Grady stood on the ridge and watched the sky. The cruiser was still up there, but the glow around its hull was dimmer now. Slower. Hesitant. He took a breath of the cold morning air, stretched his neck, and opened the old satchel. Inside was a small metallic cube, humming faintly. He pressed his thumb against the center. Somewhere above, a pulse of energy bounced between 3 hidden towers and created a blind spot so massive the aliens couldn't see half the planet. The night sky above the Pacific was black as ink, with only the faintest shimmer of stars pushing through the atmosphere. But at 40,000 feet, just below radar detection, a shape cut through the darkness with surgical precision. The jet was old, pre-fusion, and ran on combustion turbines so outdated they were no longer considered functional by Earth's militaries. But that was the point. It was invisible because no one was looking for it. Inside the narrow cockpit, Tessa gripped the controls with a practiced calm. Her hair was shorter now, grayer than it used to be, but her eyes never stopped scanning. She had flown for the kind of missions that weren't recorded. The ones where failure didn't mean embarrassment, it meant erasure. And yet tonight, with her heart beating slow and steady, she felt something new. A presence. Grady sat behind her, cross-legged like a man waiting for a train, eyes half closed. They didn't speak much during the flight. There wasn't much to say. Grady had given her coordinates. Low orbit, behind the cruiser's blind side where the satellite inversion had severed their rear sensors. The cruiser was massive, larger than any Earth craft, and shimmered like oil in water. Tessa angled toward its waste cycle ports. It was an unguarded entry point because the aliens hadn't considered it a threat. That kind of arrogance only worked against them. As the hatch opened with a gentle hiss, Grady stood and adjusted the strap of his satchel. He looked at Tessa and said, without humor, "You don't have to come in." She raised an eyebrow, grinned like the old days, and replied, "You still give terrible pep talks." Then she shut the hatch behind him and angled the jet into a slow drift, waiting for the extraction signal that hadn't been used in 30 years. Grady dropped into the ventilation shaft like he was made of air. His boots barely made a sound. The metal beneath him was alien, clean, unfamiliar, yet the ship's layout reminded him of something. Not its design, but the arrogance behind it. Straight corridors, overexposed lighting, too few redundant systems. A fortress built by engineers who never expected sabotage. He navigated without a map, just reading the pressure in the floor, the gaps in sound, the magnetic fields humming around junctions. He wasn't guessing. He was remembering. A door loomed ahead, sealed tight with a biolock. Grady didn't try to override it. Instead, he slid a small coin-sized disc from his coat and pressed it against the side panel. The metal clicked. Then the door just opened. The coin wasn't magic. It was a handshake key, built from stolen code decades ago, the kind of thing Earth's war architects had buried deep inside what they gave away during peace conferences. A back door left behind, waiting for the day someone needed to walk through it. Inside the command deck, Commander Velra stared at holograms flickering around him. Nothing made sense. Earth's energy signature had spiked twice, but not from the cities. From nowhere. The cruiser's own internal logic had begun rejecting commands at random. His tactical officer shouted that their propulsion system had rerouted all power to auxiliary venting without being told to. Another officer screamed that their targeting grid had gone dark. And then the door at the far end of the chamber slid open with a soft chime. Velra turned to see a man walk into the room wearing a flannel shirt and an old earth coat. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't armored. He looked like a maintenance worker who had taken a wrong turn. For a moment, no one moved. Then Velra laughed. "You came here to talk. That's all?" Grady stepped further into the room, hands relaxed at his sides. "Talking was never my job," he said. Velra gestured toward the guards flanking the command deck, but before they moved, the lights overhead dimmed. The deck's gravity inverted for a moment, then stabilized. A soft tone echoed from the floor beneath them. "Systems rebooting. Foreign operating system detected. Rewriting command hierarchy." Grady pulled a small black cable from his pocket and clipped it to a panel on the wall. It snapped in place magnetically. Behind him, lights shifted from violet to soft green. The ship groaned. Not from damage, but from confusion. The walls were listening to a new voice now. Grady said softly, "You built your cruiser using code you barely understood. Your engineers copied Earth's neural firmware 30 years ago. You never thought to change the root keys. You didn't even know what they were." Velra tried to issue a command through his console, but it rejected him. The panel flashed a symbol he'd never seen before, a helix with a diagonal slash. He turned pale. "What are you?" he demanded. Grady smiled. "I'm the guy who wrote the bug reports on your firmware before you even stole it." The guards lunged forward, but the floor shifted instantly, tilting just enough to throw them off balance. Magnetic clamps activated at their feet. They hit the floor, trapped in place. No alarms sounded. No weapons were fired. The ship wasn't being attacked. It was being claimed. Grady walked toward the central console, removed the cable, and replaced it with a device that looked like a harmonica. It pulsed once. Then the ship's main screen activated and began broadcasting to every major network across Earth and space. The image was clear, centered, and unmistakable. Grady stood calmly in the heart of the alien cruiser beside Velra, who now sat bound in a containment field of his own ship's making. Grady didn't address Earth's leaders. He didn't address the aliens watching. He simply looked into the camera and said, "They told the galaxy we had no power. They were right. Because power isn't what you flaunt. It's what you save for when someone thinks you've got nothing left." With that, the screen went black. Inside the cruiser, the systems hummed as though they were learning how to breathe again. Earth's old systems had never been decommissioned. They had been buried. Weighted. Grown teeth in the dark. And now, with one device, Grady had brought them back online through the bones of his enemy. Velra tried to speak, but the field around him muted every word. Grady walked back to the hallway. The ship responded to his footsteps, guiding him gently through the curves of its new hierarchy. He passed through the ventilation shaft again, hooked a line to the extraction point, and felt the grip of Tessa's old jet pull him back into Earth's sky. As they broke through the clouds, he looked out the window and saw the cruiser drifting slowly behind them, no longer violet, but green and blue and humming with human code. Tessa looked over her shoulder. "That went better than I expected," she said. Grady didn't reply right away. He stared at the sky where stars blinked quietly above them. Then he said, "It's not over." "Not yet. We just reminded them that Earth remembers how to bite." She nodded. "And this time, we bite first." The dust hadn't even settled from Earth's victory when the media began its desperate scramble. News networks fired up emergency broadcasts filled with more confusion than clarity. Anchor desks swarmed with analysts, scientists, former generals, and self-declared alien experts all claiming they knew exactly what had happened. The cruiser had not been destroyed. It had not been forced to retreat. It had simply gone quiet, drifting in Earth's orbit like a monument that no longer knew which side it was on. Every communication system on the planet had played the same final message, Grady standing in the alien control deck beside the restrained Narlan commander, delivering a quiet truth that no one could ignore. It hadn't been a war. It had been a reminder. And Earth had reminded them well. Within hours, the cruiser was declared under human custody. No nation claimed full ownership. How could they? It wasn't their technology, and none of them had made it surrender. Instead, they collectively named it Earth's first interstellar defense ship. The Operator. Its systems hummed with unfamiliar protocols, reprogrammed by strings of ancient code that no one could fully explain. Scientists from around the world were allowed limited access, but their instruments failed to decode most of the ship's controls. One room constantly broadcasted a binary loop that translated to a single word: smile. The search for Grady began immediately. Governments issued statements requesting his cooperation. Some called him a hero. Others questioned the legality of what he had done. A few tried to claim it was a joint operation gone rogue. But every time someone tried to take credit, their systems glitched. Press briefings cut out. Files disappeared mid-download. A memo circulated among high-ranking officials warning that forcing a narrative might trigger another override. It was clear someone was still watching. Quietly. Thoroughly. And without any intention of being found. In Washington, a senator held up a medal meant for Grady and insisted it be delivered personally. The following morning, the senator's office received a package. Inside was the medal, melted halfway through, and a note that read, "Medals are for closing acts. He's still moving." Elsewhere, a team of high-tech bounty contractors attempted to trace the origin of the final cruiser hack. They managed to get as far as a signal relay in Arizona before their systems froze and began looping footage of chickens. Actual chickens. On repeat. For 9 hours. People began telling stories. A waitress from Wyoming described a man who always left behind coins she'd never seen before. A cattle rancher claimed a stranger helped fix his water system 2 weeks before the invasion and told him to make sure his fencing grounded properly, though no explanation was given. A gas station clerk remembered a man who paid in cash and asked if their landline still worked. He had smiled when it rang a minute later, and walked out without saying a word. The more stories appeared, the less certain anyone was if Grady had ever actually stopped moving. It felt like he had simply passed through places like a whisper, just long enough to tune something important. On a quiet street in Berlin, Victor walked with a slow stride, his cane tapping lightly along the pavement. Pigeons scattered around him. A boy ran past him holding a toy drone, and Victor smiled. In his coat pocket, a small metallic coin pulsed once and went cold. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. That was just the confirmation. The cleanup had started. Across oceans, Clara leaned over a bread table at a market, smiling at customers, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. Beneath the table, her boot pressed lightly against the sealed case. She never opened it, just made sure it was still there. And back in Tennessee, a water tower blinked one last red light, then went dark forever. In orbit, scientists working aboard the operator discovered an encrypted file buried deep within the ship's system. They tried for days to open it using everything they had. Nothing worked. Then, without warning, the file opened on its own. It played a short message. No audio. Just text, scrolling like credits on a screen. It read, "Earth is not broken. Earth is not slow. Earth is not weak. Earth is not yours." Then, beneath it, a timestamp counting backward from 7 days appeared. No one knew what it meant. But the file closed after reaching 0. And it never opened again. Weeks passed. The skies returned to normal. The alien ships that once circled like vultures now kept their distance. Galactic diplomats reached out cautiously. Earth's leadership responded formally but without urgency. The world had changed in a matter of hours, and those who knew the truth understood that its protector didn't sit in any capital. He didn't wear a uniform. He didn't issue threats. He walked. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow. But always forward. In the diner back in Wyoming, Lucy found herself wiping down booth 4 more often than usual. No one ever sat there. Not even regulars. The seat was still warm in memory, as if someone might walk in any minute, sit down, and ask for coffee. One morning, she found a coin resting on the table. Same symbol. Same weight. But this one had a new mark etched into the edge. It read, "Not done yet." No ceremony was held. No official date was recorded for when Earth became something the galaxy feared. It just happened. Quietly. Like most real power does. And somewhere, in a train station that no longer processed passengers, a figure stood beneath a flickering light. Grady wore a coat zipped halfway, boots scuffed from walking across ground few people remembered. He sat on a bench with no destination board. In his hands, a folded paper. The same one he had always carried. The ink had faded in places, but the pattern remained. A map of sorts. Not of land. Not of stars. But of signals. He unfolded it once more and stared at it like an old friend. A gust of wind pushed past him, carrying with it the smell of rain and dust and copper. He stood, stretched his back slowly, then tucked the paper into his coat. His eyes looked down the empty platform. There was no train. Not yet. But that didn't matter. He began walking again, down the tracks this time, alone, calm, with a pace that told the Earth he wasn't done. Somewhere behind him, systems blinked back to life. Not loudly. Not in anger. Just ready. The message had been delivered. The response had been issued. And the operator? The operator had simply smiled and moved on.